This is Parahan, and you are listening to the Parahan Show. I don't know if you guys have been following this Gabby Petito case, but this is very strange. This is a real true crime mystery, and it's very odd because it seems so hard to believe that so many things could have been missed. Now, what I find strange about this case is that there was enough reasonable suspicion that this Brian guy, this boyfriend, that he may have been guilty of something. He may have been up to something because he returns to town without his girlfriend. And a couple weeks prior to this, he stopped in a traffic stop for a domestic dispute. And he doesn't tell the family or anybody where Gabby's at. And it's just odd that the authorities would go to speak to him and he refuses to talk. And they simply say, okay, that's fine. Because you would think that they would detain him, which they could legally do. They could detain him for 72 hours. And after that, if they didn't charge him with a crime, they would have to let him go. But, he wouldn't be being arrested or being charged with a crime. They would simply be detaining him, which is within their rights to do, to question him, to try and get answers, and as well keep him from running. But they didn't do that. They didn't follow that kind of protocol when there was enough suspicion there to detain this guy. And even if they didn't detain him, it's odd that they didn't charge him with obstruction when he refused to work with authorities on this missing person case, this missing person investigation. He did not want to cooperate. And to me, that's clearly obstruction. And, if you want to go past that, why couldn't they have found something to charge him on, an expired tag or something, just to bring him in, to kind of get him to talk, to get some questions, to get some answers from him? Because it's, as an investigator, I've been a paranormal investigator for 15 years now, and the first 48 hours are the most crucial point of an investigation, because that's when you're going to get your most information, your most evidence is going to come out of those first 48 hours. So this is a crucial time, yet they did not pursue this at all, which seems very odd to me. And let's say they didn't want to charge him or arrest him or bring him in even. Why were they not following this guy? Why were they not monitoring him or keeping a close eye on him when this is a key witness in a high-profile case? It's like they didn't care if he skipped town. They almost let him skip town, which seems very odd to me. Or why weren't they trying to protect this guy who has gathered national attention and could be at risk because people are upset over this case? But they failed to do these things, and he got a 3 days head start on skipping town, and he's probably in Mexico by now. My guess, if I had to say, I think it's possible he returned up to Wyoming, where the body of Gabby was found, right? Because I think he was trying to go back and cover his tracks. He didn't realize it would gather this much attention, and he didn't realize this many people had seen him. And so I think he was heading back to the crime scene, which in 90% of crimes, the criminal always returns to the crime scene. And I think he was headed back there. I've heard stories that he's possibly been spotted in Alabama. I've heard he's been spotted maybe in Texas and even in Mexico. So it's hard to say, but he had a 3-day head start. He could have gotten very far. But yet, for some reason, and this is the next strange part about this, is that when they finally decided to pursue speaking with Brian, he had disappeared, and his parents said, he went out for a hike, the other day and didn't come back. and we found his car at this some sort of forest preserve or some sort of swamp down there in Florida, and we brought his car back home. And it seems to me like this was some sort of cover story, and that they were trying to distract the law enforcement so that he could potentially get away. This was some sort of ruse, because I highly doubt that he was there, and it seems like the parents are sort of lying or covering for this guy. Now, it just seems strange that they would do this. They've been searching for several days now in this area where the parent said he's at, but I don't believe he's there. You know, it sounds like a complete fabrication and a lie, you know, so I don't know why they would be searching in this area so heavily when he's probably somewhere else. He's probably in Wyoming, or he's probably in Mexico by now. So it just seems crazy to think that they would miss so many things, and they would be so wrong on so many levels. But what's interesting is this area of Grand Teton National Park there in Wyoming. There's been several disappearances this year. In fact, when they were searching for Gabby, they thought they might stumble across potentially some other people who had been missing, and there was other missing persons cases that have been unsolved in that same general area of the Grand Teton National Park. And if you look back several years, there's been tons of unsolved disappearances and strange things that have happened in that national park, as well as many other national parks. In fact, an author, David Paul Dees, has written a book called Missing 411, which talks about the thousands of unsolved cases of missing people who have disappeared and vanished without a trace in these national parks all over the country. And it seems to be almost crazy when you look at it, how many people disappear in national parks. And you know, you have to wonder what is going on. Why is it that national parks seem to have more disappearances, more people disappear there than any other place in the country? You know, what I find interesting about these national parks and these places like this is that the Native Americans who've lived here for thousands of years, they've seen these places as sort of sacred. Some of these places they've seen as places that radiated bad energy, and that they didn't want to go there, and that they should avoid that place. And it's almost like they knew something was going on there at these places, at Yellowstone, at Grand Teton, you know, at Yosemite. It's like they knew stuff happened there, so they knew to avoid it. And they, you know, this was a bad place to stay away, to avoid, an evil place. And there's a lot of legends in which they talk about, you know, bad things happening in these areas. And one of the things I find fascinating about Native American culture is they speak of something called the Wendigo, which essentially is when a person, you see, inside us, they believe that inside every person there was good and evil, and that evil could overtake the good inside a person, and that person would become pure evil, and he would be so consumed he wouldn't be human anymore. He would be almost monster. And this is what the Wendigo was. The Wendigo was essentially the monster inside us all coming out and overtaking the person, and the evil winning and overtaking the person. In fact, they no longer had human qualities anymore. They were very animalistic, almost like a monster. And this is why they depict it as almost animalistic, with horns, deer antlers, and a skeleton face, and very skinny and tall, you know, because they basically turned into this monster. And you have reports of these Wendigo, as they call them, all over these national parks and in these areas at one time that were sacred to them, and or places that they avoided. And so I find it very interesting that you see this connection there. And I often wondered, um, is it these national parks that sort of bring you closer to yourself? And sometimes being brought closer to yourself, you realize that maybe you're not a good person, or you see that darkness inside you, that evil inside you, and that tends to sometimes bring out that evil inside you, and it consumes you, and you almost become like a monster. And is this what happens to people sometimes when they go to national parks? I've heard a lot of people say they go to these national parks, they go out in nature, and it's very spiritual, and it brings out sort of this new energy in them. It brings out the best in them. But at the same time, could going to these parks bring out the worst in us and bring out what's bad in us and allow that to come up, something that's been hidden deep inside of us that we've been suppressing? Could that potentially come up and rise to the surface when we get out in nature and we're alone with ourselves and we have an opportunity to examine ourselves? And what I find interesting is when you look at sort of this Brian guy, he seemed to be sort of like a spiritual guy, and he wanted to be one with nature, and he seemed very connected with nature. And from what I understand is that he often quoted about how being spiritual and connected with the land and how it was sort of bringing him to a better understanding and a new enlightenment almost. And I have to wonder, when he goes out to these national parks and they're visiting these national parks and he has time to examine himself and he's alone with himself, does he start to see the darkness inside him? Does that start to rise to the surface? So, maybe, and I think with a lot of people, you see this in certain people, and I've noticed this with certain people. There's some people, I look at them and I say, just something's a little off with them, You can see some hints of darkness. It's almost like, there's a tiny little hole opening up and you can see a little bit of that shining out, coming out of them. And it's like you can tell with certain people that this person potentially one day could be something bad. It could be something horrible, because you see that in little things that they do, or just things that they say to you, or the way they talk, or the way they present themselves gives away little clues or hints. And I've seen that with some people, where you see that little bits of them and you say, deep down inside, I think there's something evil in that person, and I think it's just a matter of time. If that gets out, that could be very bad. And and that's why there's certain people that I do tend to avoid, because I've seen that in them. And I said, there's just something, you see that in that person, a strange look. Even sometimes you get a strange look from someone and you can almost see it in their eyes, when you look at someone. And in fact, a lot of ancient cultures, called this, the Egyptians, the Greeks, they called this the evil eye, in which they didn't like to look people directly in the eye, because they believed that if a person was evil, then that could be transferred onto you by staring at them, and that you could see the evil in someone's eyes. And you see this in many cultures, in Asian cultures, certain Asian cultures, they believe it's disrespectful to stare someone straight in the eye. And even to this day, other cultures, they believe it's not appropriate to look someone directly in the eye, because they're worried that, potentially you could transfer this evil, essentially. And I've noticed that, you see certain people and you see this look in their eye and something's off about them. And, you could just kind of tell that person, just by looking at them through their eyes, you sort of see that evil inside them, and it's kind of terrifying, But essentially, my point is that, did Brian go out into the wilderness, into these national parks, and sort of find a piece of himself that had been deep down and suppressed, and that all came out, and this is what you've seen, it's definitely interesting when you think about it. But let's say, let's look at alternative possibilities. Now, could, and this is something that, I've often thought about. If a person, right, people all the time, you fight with your significant other. If that person, you had a fight with your significant other, okay, and it got pretty heated, and people noticed that, right? And then let's say, a couple days after that, you guys are like, on a road trip, or you're out camping, and you go off for a minute and you come back and you find that that person has like died, someone has essentially killed them, but there's no one in sight. You're the only person in sight. You guys have just been rocky and been fighting, right? They're going to think that you did this, and you're going to think in your mind, I'm going to be the first person they're going to suspect because there's no one around. There's no other people. I'm the only person here, So to some extent, you could kind of see if Brian was in the situation where he wasn't the guilty person, but he went off on his own for a little bit, came back and found her dead, could he, what would he potentially do? He'd be terrified probably, and this would cause him to maybe freak out and not know what to do, because he's going to think, they're going to undoubtedly think that I'm guilty, even though I'm not guilty, but they're going to suspect me because we just had this altercation running with the law enforcement. So they're going to suspect me, they're going to think that I am guilty. And so you have to think, you could see that possibly happening, and you could see that in some instances, but I don't necessarily think that's the case with this, And I often wonder too, like, imagine if, like, and as crazy as it sounds, but imagine if Bigfoot is real. Imagine if alien abduction is real, right? And you're with your significant other, and that person is essentially, killed by a Bigfoot or abducted by extraterrestrials. Think of how crazy that would be to have to explain that to law enforcement, that this person is missing because they were attacked by Bigfoot or because they were abducted by extraterrestrials. They would think you're crazy, and they would automatically suspect you. And that's the interesting thing I think about is, is there ever cases like that? Could that potentially ever happen, where that could have happened and automatically they suspected that person because they were simply the most likely candidate, and they thought that what they were talking about was crazy, but that's just something that I find interesting. But that's what I'm saying. Is it possible that something else happened? I think we have to wait for the results of the autopsy and to figure out what's going on. But I think that there's always that potential that something else could have went on, that it could have been someone else. There could be potentially a serial killer on the loose there in Grand Teton. I mean, not too terribly far from there, you had that married couple that had vanished and then been found dead, and had been murdered. So there's definitely something odd going on there. And what's interesting too, and I forgot to mention that, is that I don't know the validity of this, if this is true or not, but apparently Brian and Gabby had encountered this missing couple that was eventually found dead within the same day that they were pulled over by law enforcement. And apparently, from what I've heard from other stories, is that it was actually this couple that called the police on Gabby and Brian. And the next day is the last time this couple was seen. So, you have to think maybe is there some sort of connection between Gabby and this couple and Brian that we don't know about, you know? And when you look at the footage, the dash cam footage of them getting pulled over, it does seem highly suspicious, you know? It seems like Brian, as they begin pursuit, he tries to speed off, and then he turns the wheel and he runs into a curb, and then they stop, and that's when the law enforcement pulls them over, right? And when they ask Brian about that, he says, you know, he was just kind of in the heat of a moment of an argument, and that Gabby grabbed the wheel and turned it into the curb. But to me, it almost appeared like he was trying to run, and Gabby stopped him by pulling the wheel and turning into the curb. And so, like, you know, it just seems like maybe perhaps there's something more to the story than they're alluding to. And if you look at how upset Gabby was then, you know, she was throwing up a lot of red flags, that she was deeply bothered by something. She was concerned. She seemed terrified, more so than a normal argument, you know, would bring about. So my question is too, you know, at that moment, you know, if I pulled them over and I'm a law enforcement agent, you know, at that point in time, I would have seen some red flags there, and I would have said, you know what, I don't think this is good, you know. I want to take in Brian, and, you know, I would have maybe, you know, pressed some sort of charges, even if they wouldn't have sticked, for, you know, something domestic, or, you know, domestic altercation, right? Even if they wouldn't have sticked, to just separate this couple, because I would have seen, you know, and I would have taken her to the you know, station and talked with her and tried to get her more comfortable, and trying to figure out if you could get any more information and see what was going on, because it seems like she's disturbed by something, and there's a lot of red flags and indicators there that she's nervous and she's scared. And I think she had an idea of who Brian was by then and what was going on to some extent, and maybe perhaps he had done some other things at these other national parks to allude to the fact that he was sort of at a breaking point, or he was breaking, and there was something bad going on, and something bad about to happen, and sort of she was afraid, and she was scared, and she was terrified, you know, because it seems like he was guilty of something already, and that he was trying to run, and he seemed very nervous when he's doing the interview. You notice that he has these scratches and cuts and bruises on him, like he'd been in some sort of altercation. You have to think that something more might have been going on. What it is, I don't know, but I definitely think right then and there is when you seen the first indication that there was something off, and that she was very concerned and worried, and that she potentially knew who Brian was at that point in time, and that's when we should have seen the red flags and knew something was up, you know. So I just want to say, you know, if you see these indicators, you know, and you ever see red flags like this, you know, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to talk to someone and ask them, say, hey, are you all right? Because, you know, I think the key to stopping these domestic assaults, you know, and these instances like this, is to simply ask someone, hey, are you all right? You know, don't be afraid to kind of, you know, ask them a couple times. Don't be afraid to raise concern to people. Don't be afraid to try and intervene, you know, and not intervene, you know, in a crazy way, but, you know, don't be afraid to try and see if you can get help, or see if that person needs help, because I think potentially in that situation, you know, there was a lot of red flags there, and I'm sure that when she had spoken with friends or family, I'm sure they've seen some sort of indicators, but, you know, and sometimes you can never tell. But if you see those red flags, you know, I feel like it's important to speak up, to say something, because when it gets to that point, you know, you only have so much time before it goes to the worst case possible, like this, you know. And I think there's a lot of cases that may have been prevented had people raise more concern and been more intuitive and had their eyes open to what was going on and sort of seen the red flags. But thank you guys for listening. I'm Parahan. As always, peace out.